Well, thank you. I'm Reshat Kasaba. I'm the director of the Jackson School, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you this evening to this event to honor our dear colleague, Donald Hellmann. In a few minutes, I will invite Professor Pyle, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Right now, my job is to welcome you all, and you're all special to us, but we have a number of very special guests, which I'd like to recognize. First of all, we have a good contingent of the Hellmann family. If I can ask them to stand up for a minute and can give them a hand. And we have Bill and Ruth Gerberding. Bill was president when I was first hired at the University of Washington, so he, along with Donald, is responsible for my being here, so I'm very pleased that they're here. We have several members of the Jackson School Advisory Board. Bill Glassford is here, and David Al-Hadaf. Make it, and I think I saw Don Lawrence is, yes. Anybody else from the, I rely on our advisory board for their advice and support, and they are a very important part of what we do at the university, at the Jackson School, so I'm very pleased to see them here. Thank you. Senior consul from the Japanese consulate, Dodo Tomoko, is, see? Okay. And I do want to recognize also our leaders, Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, Robert Stacy, Divisional Dean of Social Sciences, Judy Howard, and Divisional Dean of Humanities, Michael Shapiro. They're here with us, so thank them also for their support and leadership. Thank you. So, one thing I know, and very few people in the audience know, and a lot of you don't know, is today is a special day. Today is the day when we are going to hear Donald Hellmann to talk to us about the world in transition, Asia in the twilight of America's century. But today also is Donald Hellmann Day. This is a special proclamation by Mayor Edward Murray. And so today, October 13th, 2014, is Donald Hellmann Day in Seattle. So I was hoping, I'm sure there are some places in the world where it's still yesterday, so tomorrow they will wake up to Donald Hellmann Day. Unfortunately, Japan is already gone, so. But let me just read the proclamation. Whereas, for nearly 5 decades, Donald Hellmann has been a professor at the University of Washington, and whereas, during his long career of teaching, Don has advised hundreds of graduate students in their master's and doctoral work, instructed thousands of University of Washington undergraduate students on topics of Japanese government, politics, and foreign policy, and was instrumental in creation of the task force capstone course requiring majors in international studies to address real-world problems. And whereas, in true Husky spirit, Don has taken on numerous extra roles in service of the university, including those of Director of the APAC Study Center, Director of the Institute for International Policy, Acting Director of the Jackson School of International Studies, and Acting Chair of the Department of Political Science. And whereas Don has raised millions of dollars for projects and programs focused on collaboration and connectivity that reach across geographic and political boundaries, and whereas Don's contribution to academia will live on in the books he has authored, the articles he has edited, and the vast numbers of articles, book reviews, and papers he has published. Now, therefore, I, Edward B. Murray, Mayor of Seattle, do hereby proclaim October 13th, 2014 to be in our city Donald C. Hellmann Day. Donald, you have the official proclamation here. Sign and seal.
I've been called many things, but never a day. Thank you very much. I'm simply blown away.
So I'd like to ask Professor Ken Pyle to come up and introduce Donald.
Well, after that, I don't think Don needs any more of an introduction. Actually, introducing Don is very easy for me. We've been colleagues for more than 45 years. Don and I actually met even before that. We were both Ford Foundation fellows in Japan in the early 1960s. At a time when the academic study of Asia was really in its infancy. And the Ford Foundation Fellows was a really interesting group. Chalmers Johnson was among us. Many of you remember Jim Pillay so well. That's where Jim and Don and I met. And it was a group. As I say, the study of Asia was in its infancy in this country, and yet we really believed that Asia was going to be very important in our time and to our country, and so it was a very exciting time. Don is an exceptionally talented person, and I think could have been successful in many other professions. If I remember, Don, you told me once that you worked in a brokerage firm. And so I thought, well, Don could have been a hedge fund manager and living a high life, or he could have been a Wall Street lawyer or whatever. But that he came to the UW and made his career here has been to our great good fortunes. The American university, being the kind of freewheeling kind of institution that it is, Don has really, I think, thrived here. He, early in his academic career, he had a wonderful fling on the stage of national politics in the 1970s. His first book was on the Japanese-Russian peace agreement. His second book was on the a broader book on the international relations of Asia, and it brought him to the attention of some liberal Republicans, when there still were some, at the American Enterprise Institute. Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, the young George H.W. Bush, all drew Don into their projects, and it culminated in what Rockefeller had started was a project for America's future called the Critical Choices for Americans. And Don was in charge of the volume of essays that came out on Asia policy. Don is a great ideas person. He's conceptual, he thinks out of the box. He's always been a gadfly, a little offbeat, an iconoclast. He always had a nose for new courses, new ways of understanding international relations. As was mentioned in the proclamation, he took charge of the APEC Study Center. He turned it into a center for the study of the internet and its influence on international politics. He more recently had this interesting concept of a global classroom, which would be made possible by teleconferencing with students in Korea and China and Japan and elsewhere. More recently, he's joined with Vince Gallucci and others in a new course on the geopolitics of the Arctic. So he's never been a conventional academic thinker. He revels in ruffling the feathers of the establishment. As he himself often says, I like to squash eggs on the tatami. It's rather graphic. He's a kind of happy warrior, and he's never attended a lecture that he didn't ask of the speaker a question that had some kind of an original twist and that often challenged the speaker's central thesis. Over the years, Don and I have taught courses together, written a book, and organized conferences together, traveled in many parts of the world together. Most of all, we have talked endlessly about ideas, the rise of Asia, the mess in Washington, and the vicissitudes of American foreign policy. So this evening, as I understand it, Don is going to weave together a lot of these themes in a talk entitled The World in Transition, Asia and the Twilight of America's Century. Don.
Well, thank you. I must say, this is really an encore after all that's going on here. I had a tough time writing this paper, somewhat to my surprise, partly because I'm usually a counterpuncher and ask questions of people who often are distinguished and scholarly, and it's quite easy to poke holes in their arguments, at least I find it so. But this time I want to hold forth on what I think is a turning point in history. In many ways, pick up briefly on what Ken said, it's a story of my life. I got involved in Asia by accident. I graduated from college and didn't know what I wanted to do. I had huge fellowships to go to business school and a fabulous job where I would have been very rich and decadent and so on. But I quickly decided that's not what I wanted to do, and I was drafted and sent to Korea. And I know how many of you have seen the wonderful comedy series called MASH. I was stationed 50 feet from MASH, and I could have written half the scripts that were there. And I have 3 copies of Catch-22 from people who served there with me. But for me, Asia was interesting for 2 reasons. I mean, one, I was appalled at the horrors of war and what had happened in Korea. It blew apart all of I went to Princeton, the conceptions that I developed on the beautiful campuses and glorious classrooms there. And secondly, I was beguiled by the cultures of both Korea and Japan, how rich they were, how different they were. And when I came back, I actually spent a year in graduate school, believe it or not, in philosophy, because I could not square what I felt was a understanding of Western civilization with what I had seen there. And when I went to Berkeley, after philosophy, I decided I better learn a language and go back and try to understand it firsthand. And that's what I have done. And as Ken pointed out, I was early brought into the policy arena, which was unusual and explains in part why I am as idiosyncratic and academic as I am and never trod the usual path. Now let me turn to my lecture. I'm going to open with 3 quotations. The first of which is the overall theme of the lecture. The world is on the cusp of the most profound shift in global power and influence in a century. Managing the quiet revolution calls for nothing short of a new international system with radical revision of existing institutions and patterns of doing business. It was pronounced by Robert Hutchins, currently the dean of the LBJ School at that time a visiting professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. It was made on the occasion of the Great Recession, when even people in the Eastern establishment were questioning the universal validity of democratic capitalism as it was developed in the United States. The second quotation is from Rudyard Kipling, the bard of British imperialism. "Oh, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky shall presently stand at God's great judgment seat." It was really the slogan of British colonialism, and it depicted a world in which convergence was inconceivable. We live in a world today that is networked by the digital revolution, by the financial system, that makes it inconceivable that anybody could say anything like Rudyard Kipling said. And yet that was the guiding principle for behavior of the West in the 19th century. The third quote is from a rather famous pundit, Michael Lewis, who writes a lot about things economic. And it was written in an article in the New York Times Magazine at the time of the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 98. The Asian crash was an intellectual event as much as an economic one. It put an end to the belief that Asian economies could be run along lines different than others. Markets force the convergence of all things, of prices and of values. A proclamation that the free market can not only change the monetary value of things, but actually can transform the way people think and approach the world. As you will find out shortly, this, in my opinion, is preposterous. Anybody who has lived in or studied Asia briefly or in depth would agree. And yet it has been the operating principle for much of American foreign policy for many years. Now let me turn to my paper, and I will try to be as quick and clear as I can. I'm not used to reading papers, but I will do this one. In 1942, Henry Luce, the most powerful journalist in the United States, and raised in China as the son of American missionaries, famously proclaimed the dawn of America's century. This was to be an era in which America's style of democratic capitalism became universalized under American leadership to create a world of peace and prosperity. It was a vision that President Woodrow Wilson had previously articulated at the Versailles Peace Conference at the end of World War I. Wilson, of course, failed to convince the United States Senate to accept his grand diplomatic strategy, but his ideas found fulfillment at the end of the Second World War. We are all basically Wilsonians, alas, or for good. As the leader of the coalition of nations that defeated the Axis powers, as the only major developed country spared from the direct ravages of the war, as a nation whose economy constituted roughly half of that of the entire world, and the only nuclear power, the United States was in a position to impose its ideals on a world devastated and war-weary. It did, and the foundation was laid for America's century. The multilateral initiative to institutionalize democracy and self-determination as the norm for global governance led to the creation of the United Nations. Similarly, and this is all derivative from Wilsonianism, similarly, an array of multilateral organizations was established at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, to facilitate economic recovery from the war and to provide an institutional framework to develop a free trade-oriented global economic system. All of these organizations, or their lineal descendants, remain on the international landscape and been dominated by the United States. The outbreak of the Cold War in 1947 profoundly affected how these institutions operated and led to the creation of new security alliances, for example, NATO, the bilateral Japan and Korea treaties, and programs, for example, the Marshall Plan, and regional economic arrangements, the European Community, in what became a bipolar global competition between the American-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Communist Bloc that lasted over 40 years. Because the various hegemonic security alliances and economic initiatives taken by Washington to contain communism involved promotion of democracy and capitalism, they were congruent with the basic aims of America's century and simply added a dimension to our strategic policy. Yet another dimension was added with the rapid, almost often violent collapse of Western colonialism that was abetted by the clause in the United Nations Charter, again authored by the United States, universalizing the right of self-determination. The good news was an end to colonialism. The bad news was that by applying self-determination to countries whose borders were established by imperial powers, over 60 undeveloped and unstable nations were created and are still with us. Although the route to triumph in the Cold War involved activities at variance with Wilsonian ideals, for example, cooperation with authoritarian regimes, being on the wrong side of an anti-colonial war in Vietnam, the collapse of the Soviet Union was generally seen as the fulfillment of the vision of America's century. And yet, first, when asked to express his version of the next phase of America's century in the wake of triumph in the Cold War, President George H.W. Bush famously mumbled, "I have trouble with the vision thing." Basically, I'm brain dead. I don't understand what you... At the end of the Cold War, Japan had become the world's largest creditor nation and the United States the largest debtor nation, while Japanese per capita GDP was 20% larger than America's. 3, barely 50 years after Henry Luce's essay, a spate of books and articles saw the future as a Japan-Asian century. The World Bank, puzzled by the success of state-led capitalism in Japan and other Asian nations, published a volume titled The East Asian Miracle. It is now time to consider the role of Asia in America's century, concentrating on the roles of Japan and China. Asia in America's century, Japan. A brief elaboration of Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy beliefs is a necessary preface to understanding how American leaders applied them to Asia, specifically to Japan and China, and how Asians reacted to them. Wilson, the son of a minister and a pioneer professor of American government at Princeton, had limited knowledge about or even interest in international affairs. Accordingly, the intellectual and personal perspectives he brought to bear on foreign policy when, as president of the United States, he reluctantly led the United States into World War I, were highly moral and uniquely derived from his understanding of the American political economy. The war was seen not so much as a foreign policy issue, but a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And his mission at Versailles was to ensure the widespread internationalization of American-style democratic institutions because, and this is a quote, "the freely expressed will of the people of all nations would deter governments from war. A democratic society would never go to war," end of quote. The second component of Wilson's international relations to ensure peace was the creation of multilateral institutions of sovereign states under American leadership. Not only was self-determination to be extended to all people, but because freedom was also an economic right, global markets should be built on free trade. These principles formed the blueprint for America's century as described by Luce. Japan, which had unconditionally surrendered after defeat in World War II, was thus exposed to the fullest expression of Wilsonianism in United States diplomacy. The United States imposed a democratic constitution it had written that also denied Japan the right to make war. It instituted a massive redistribution of land, dissolved the zaibatsu, the business monopolies that had dominated the pre-war Japanese economy, and purged or tried political and business leaders involved in the war. Although some of these reforms were modified with the outbreak of the Cold War, the purged pre-war political elite returned at the end of the occupation, and they and their progeny, and I mean the word progeny, their family, their lineal descendants, have played a central role in Japanese government ever since, and they still do today. Mr. Abe is related to Prime Minister Kishi, who is a Class A war criminal, but became Prime Minister of Japan 4 years after the end of the occupation, to the astonishment of certainly the Japanese. America ended its occupation conditional on a hegemonic bilateral security treaty that made Japan a defense satellite of the United States, and then in turn allowed Japan to maintain a disproportionately small defense budget and enhance the resources spent on its growth, economic growth. At first glance, Japan has been a democracy for more than 60 years, operating within the perimeters of the 1947 Constitution. Not a word has been changed. With regular elections, majority rule procedures in the Diet, freedom of speech and assembly, and a legal system that, within limits, has played an important role in governance. But a closer look at Japan's politics quickly indicates that the species of democracy seen there is not identical with the pluralistic, individual rights-centered American model. Japan is an elitist democracy. All modern democracies are in some way elitist, but what is distinctive about the Japanese version is its deep historical and cultural roots in the peculiarly effective web of connections, personal, economic, legal, social, political, and cultural, that circumscribe recruitment into the elite, define relations among its members, and regulate interaction with the masses. Indeed, what is most distinctive about Japan is not the profound impact of the revolutionary democratic reforms initiated by the American occupation, but the continuity of Japanese political culture in terms of personalized, distinct from policy, political competition. There is, for example, an astonishing continuity among the families that dominate conservative party leadership. Of the last 8 prime ministers, all but one had family members, often spanning generations, who held similar posts. This is not to say that things have not changed, but the Wilsonian notion that individual voters decide who governs and what policies they follow and decide who governs and what policies they follow needs significant modification when looking at Japan. What makes the Japanese case particularly interesting relates to the impact of the Japanese economy on its political system. Economic prosperity leading to the rise of a middle class is commonly seen as promoting democracy by enhancing the interests of the masses in government economic policy. The Japanese economic miracle long ago produced a middle class, but this has not profoundly shaped electoral behavior, except perhaps to marginalize left-wing opposition parties. Moreover, Japan did not adopt the free market and free trade formula that America sought to create. Indeed, the success of Japanese state-led capitalism in the context of the Western Bloc liberal trading order became a source of bitter bilateral conflict as Japan became an international economic competitor of the United States from the mid-1970s. Japan and the United States are today close economic partners, but this has involved protracted trade negotiations. Convergence of the domestic political economy in Japan to the American way remains incomplete. The existence of the American Security Alliance was critical and an inviolate link to bilateral relations, particularly during the Cold War. The 60-year-old United States-Japan alliance is regularly cited in Washington and in Tokyo as the unchanged cornerstone for the strategic policy of both countries toward the rest of Asia. Yet, the alliance is in need of revision to address the new and rapidly changing realities in Asia and the world, especially to address the emergence of China-centered East Asia into the center of the global political economy. The alliance was created to meet the challenges of the raging war in Korea, a 1950 alliance between communist China and the Soviet Union, and to formally institutionalize Japan into the Western Bloc. The hegemonic alliance involving bases and over 200,000 American soldiers, together with the so-called peace constitution, left the Japanese on the sidelines of the Cold War. Japan still remains a forgotten player in international affairs, and the United States has taken no serious initiatives to restructure the alliance. Consequently, the alliance, born of the exigencies of the early Cold War and to further assure Japan's democratization, is embarrassingly outdated. For example, will the United States really go to war with China, a nuclear nation and a global economic powerhouse, over 2 uninhabited rocks in the East China Sea, as the treaty mandates? That's, to put it generously, unlikely. And yet, that's, if you literally take the treaty, what we're expected to do. The treaty, in fact, can be instructively compared to the challenge for survival faced by the coelacanth. Now, I know Vince the Gallucci might know what a coelacanth is, but I doubt if many other people in the room know what it is. A coelacanth. The coelacanth is the world's oldest species of fish. It's a 400 million old living fossil. Discovered in 1938, it is utterly incapable of adapting to the conditions that are even marginally different from the environment it has lived for 40,000 millennia. It precedes the dinosaurs. It's a fish that has incipient legs on its back, which preceded the reptiles going onto land, and it still is alive off the coast of Kenya and Tanzania and in Sumatra and Indonesia. The genome of the U.S.-Japan alliance has elements susceptible to the coelacanth syndrome. The alliance was nurtured for almost 4 decades in the strategic Cold War greenhouse that was made in America, a period in which Japan never developed an independent strategy while becoming the world's 2nd largest economy. After the Cold War, nothing basic was done, leaving both America and Japan largely passive players as China-centered Asia moved to the center of the global political economy. Strategic inertia in Washington, as well as Tokyo, has made the alliance a kind of Cold War coelacanth, symptomatic of the decline of America's century. Japan, paradoxically, at once represents a spectacular triumph of American strategy, and at the same time is a symbol of the contemporary, increasingly interdependent but non-convergent world, which is in need of a new set of international mediating institutions appropriate to new international realities. Now, China. China has for centuries been an object of fascination, bewilderment, and concern to the Western world. And 20th century America was no exception. In spite of its importance, information about the largest country, rightly civilization, in Asia was filtered through a motley group of sources: missionaries, adventurers, a small group of scholars, colonialists, business and political, journalists, and even international revolutionaries, such as Leon Trotsky, who was fluent in Chinese and actually was in China for quite some time. The resulting image of China, what one scholar rightly called scratches on our minds, led to the semi-informed exploitative results, an ecumenical cascade of failures that included Britain, Japan, the Soviet Union, and then, as America's century began, the United States. Pearl Harbor was preceded by the Japanese invasion of China, and therefore Washington supported the Chinese nationalist government during the Pacific War, and as a great power, that is, membership in the United Nations Security Council. When in the Civil War, Mao's Chinese Communists won and forged an alliance with the USSR, and then intervened in the Korean War in 1950, Chinese lost hundreds of thousands of their troops, including one of Mao's sons in the Korean War. This assured that China would be a Cold War adversary and diplomatically unrecognized by the United States for 3 decades. China's role in America's century was utterly negative from 1949 to 1978. as a politically authoritarian nuclear nation practicing state capitalism so successfully that has a GNP equal to and is the largest creditor of the United States, China now has evolved to become an alternative international model to democratic capitalism. All of this has happened while, not quite while I was reading, but very quickly. These international crises since the end of the Cold War illustrate the dimensions of this challenge to democratic capitalism. Three international crises since the end of the Cold War illustrate the dimensions of this challenge by China to democratic capitalism. The Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, the American response to the 9/11 terrorist attack, and the Great Recession of 2008. The Asian economic crisis of 1997-98 was a threshold event in modern international affairs, with effects that were global. Russia's ruble collapsed, the Russian economy collapsed as a consequence of decline in the Thai baht, if you can believe all this, demonstrating what the economists called contagion, but really means the link, the networked link of the financial institutions. It marked the end, it presaged the end of the American-led globalist economic boom that was the principal feature of the 1990s post-Cold War interregnum. Occurring at a time when it was widely believed that the Asian century was about to dawn, the economic crisis shocked all of the countries in the region into an awareness of the costs and realities of being an integral and important part of a highly interdependent world, not just region, but world. Although China and Japan were not directly affected, as seen from Asia, the shock transcended the short-term political and economic costs to encompass the decisive dominance of American political economic power, and as a condition for emergency loans, the overbearing imposition of the Western norms that legitimate the international economic system, the Washington Free Trade Consensus. In consequence, an important and somewhat paradoxical byproduct of this crisis of globalization and Asia was the heightened sense of regionalism. Moreover, not only did the Asian regional economy quickly return to the pre-crisis levels of growth, in contradiction to the report of the IMF, but there was no mention in its report of China, which became almost instantly the dominant economic power in the region and the second largest economy in the world. I've written extensively on this crisis, actually, a book and another lengthy conference, and it is simply appalling that these people, on examining Asia, blamed them for what they call crony capitalism, and said you had to shake your culture if you wanted to do it and be like us. This mandate, and then of course, Miss China. Now, these are not graduate students or low-life professors. These are people who, from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, who are paid to be authorities on this stuff, and that they should misjudge so completely not only the diagnosis of the problem of Asia and its future, but to ignore China is simply appalling. It would certainly earn an F in a course I taught. Anyway, the 1997 crisis served as a preface to the second threshold event, the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States that provoked an activist and astonishingly unilateral American security policy response to retaliate for the terrorist attack and to deter future such attacks by democratizing Afghanistan and Iraq. This was Wilsonian with a twist. You now created democracy at the end of a bayonet. That had disastrous results, obviously, and cast a shadow over U.S. political leadership in the world, just as the earlier crisis had raised questions about the applicability of the free trade component characterized of America's century. And finally, the third event, The collapse of the United States real estate market in 2008, rooted in massive financial malfeasance by American banks, precipitated the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Asia actually was affected less than most, and China barely at all. But in the wake of the other two crises, this event caused petals to fall in greater profusion from the bloom of American democratic capitalism and raised doubts about the end of the American century, even among the political elite in this country. Together, these three events marked the onset of a new but still inchoate post-Cold War global political economy and exposed three fundamental factors, international tectonic plates, I would call them, that will shape its development. These are, one, the inadequacies of existing multilateral institutions to manage the challenges of the contemporary international system. Two, the limitations of a laissez-faire approach to adequately, I lost my place, to adequately manage both economic and political process in a comprehensively networked world. It needs management. And three, a vacuum in global leadership. The United States, the only power with global reach economically and militarily, has neither attempted to breathe life into the existing made in America multilateral institutions, but rather has crafted ad hoc and largely unilateral solutions in incremental fashion. This situation raises two issues fundamental to the theme of this lecture. How can a China-led Asia, a multiple-decade success story with distinctly non-American cast and plot, be integrated on reciprocal terms into an ever more interdependent but diverse, non-convergent world? Two, is it even possible to create a new global framework of international institutions such as those seen in America's century? One thing is certain. It is almost inconceivable that China, a nation that will soon be the largest international economy in the world while practicing authoritarian capitalism under the single-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party, converge to Western democratic capitalism, Wilsonian democratic capitalism in its near future. Although the ultimate shape of the Chinese political economy may differ from its current form, for the foreseeable future, it is singularly improbable that a society that has, one, survived under Confucianism for more than 2 millennia, two, in the last century and a half, experienced the most comprehensive revolution of any country in history, and three, has successfully brought millions of its citizens out of poverty while digesting the industrial and digital revolutions, is likely to reject its culture and history to Americanize. China's nationalism alone inhibits the creation of a global vision with international public goods seen in Wilsonianism in the foreseeable future. Indeed, for the first part of the 21st century, a Sino-American interregnum seems likely to follow America's century until a new synthesis of Wilsonianism and an Asian-rooted international political economy comes into being. In conclusion, what then is to be done? And this is another quote, not one of my favorite ones, but useful. It's from George W. Bush. The 20th century, and it's from a West Point graduation address made in 2002, and it was designed to be used by me in this paper. The 20th century ended with a single surviving model of human progress based on non-negotiable demands of human dignity, rule of law, and limits on the power of the state. In other words, America's century lives on. It is not just former President Bush, but the overwhelming majority of American politicians, foreign policy specialists, media pundits, as well as the public, maybe most people in this room, I don't know, that are likely to suffer from this myopia of nationalist universalism manifested in the rationale for America's century. Alas, it is an infectious global disease transcending political borders and cultures. That is, we're not the only ones that have it, obviously. This will deter but not prevent the development of a new framework for managing common interests while preserving the political, economic, and cultural diversity of the international landscape present in a networked but diverse world. Although governments, finally now in conclusion, although governments hold the ultimate power, the impetus for and the substance of needed comprehensive change is likely to come from non-governmental groups. In other words, governments, including especially our own right now, but all governments are unlikely to engage in the kind of speculative and creative thinking seen at the beginning of America's century, or even what is needed today. Governments retain authority, but domestic political economic pressures and bureaucracies organized to implement, not ask new appropriate questions, are barriers to innovative strategies that were seen at the dawn of America's century. However, the challenge to peace and prosperity in the 20th century were focused on a conventional military and economic issues, plus strategic nuclear concerns. But the security menu in the globalized 21st century is both longer and more varied. Issues such as energy, global health, the digital revolution, and global warming supplement as priority concerns in foreign policy. To create an array of new multilateral institutions appropriate to this diverse multipolar world will involve protracted and strong leadership and fresh, complex strategic policies. The challenge is obviously global and will involve emerging as well as developed nations. But in the first half of the 21st century, it is certain that the most fundamental challenge will involve the United States and China-led Asia. Finally, as almost appropriate because of this Hellmann Day stuff, a personal note about the University of Washington and Seattle. It turns out that both the UW and Seattle are at the center of 4 of the major trends or problems that will determine international order in the 21st centuries. First is the digital revolution. We live in the Silicon Forest. We have Microsoft and Amazon. And we also have one of the best computer science departments, as well as an array of international specialists that can relate technology to action. Second is global health. I can shorten this because the Ebola stuff. But clearly, the medical school, the largest foundation in the world devoted to global health, ensure that a partnership between the university and the broader community is a logical, if not inevitable, development. I doubt if our future university could succeed unless it got a nice working relationship with the Gates Foundation. Thirdly is global warming, something that Ken alluded I'm interested in. I just, believe it or not, went with Vince above the Arctic Circle in Norway to talk about governance of the Arctic Council of a world up there, how Asian nations, China in particular, will behave when they join the Arctic Council. And I'm sure they're hugging polar bears and kissing baby seals is not exactly high priority on their list, but that is what much of that is done. And we have a wonderful oceanography department, perhaps the best in the country. We have a new college of the environment, and we have an array of other fisheries and other and law and whatever that can deal with this. Fourthly, and apropos of this lecture, we have especially on Asia. Not only the Jackson School, but the law school, the business school, the Asian Languages and Literature Department, and in the community, the Seattle Art Museum, the Chinese Garden, the very vibrant ethnic communities that exist here and which support in large part the university directly. Seattle and the UW are in a position to play a part in defining, asking the right questions about where history is going. It is appalling to me that our government would instead ask what you would do if your budget was cut 15%. That will assure that we are a footnote to history, not part of it. And I wish to end by saying that I think the materials are here for the university and for many people in this room to take an active role in redirecting the world in the twilight of the Asian America's century to a bright and prosperous future. Certainly, I'm in the twilight of my career, and I'm doing my best to do it, and I urge you all to do the same. Thank you. I know there's food and drink back there, and I'm sure you've had your fill of my circulating air. But there is a question period, and if those of you are either provoked to question me or cheer me, please raise your hands. Please.
I have one for you. So when you say China led Asia, presumably you mean that kind of by default now China is the biggest and strongest country in Asia. Do you see a situation where other nations actually get in line behind China, or will it remain, kind of driven with?
Well, a good question. I'm not suggesting that China is going to lead Asia in the sense of providing a legitimate framework for cooperation. I suspect that China will, in the foreseeable future, pursue its own national interests, in many cases very foolishly, to the detriment of that. But the problem is that, there is consensus among intelligence agencies, multinational banks, everybody, that within 2 decades or so, even, they wouldn't even say that China will be not only bigger than the United States, but massively bigger. Now, let's, for argument's sake, assume they fail, or assume that doesn't happen, they just fail right now. What do you think the consequences would be? The issue is not so much that China knows what they want to do. They don't. They're delighted to have us stumble around in the Middle East and elsewhere. I was at a conference there 2 years ago where they openly said this. As long as you're willing to, even though they now are the major importers of Middle Eastern oil, they're just saying, well, please be our guest. You muck around over there, and we'll cut our deals with Iran and whoever else is around. And so I guess what I'm saying is that China is so big, is so integral. I mean, and again, reciprocally, they own over, they're the largest creditor to the United States, and they're not going to pull the plug on that, but it provides them with opportunities to be a player. And in ways, and the second point is that they are led by aggressive, shrewd nationalists in ways China is not. Korea probably is, but they're too small. And I don't know who leads the United States right now. Maybe no one, despite the fact that we are clearly the dominant and most powerful military and economic power in the world. So my answer to you is convoluted in the sense that, yeah, I don't think we're going to have a dawn of a China century or an Asian century led by China, but we sure are going to have to deal with the fact that that region of the world is already bigger than North America and will get bigger. And I don't know what's going to happen. If you've got Vladimir Putin's mucking around and anything, but the point is that they're not going to embrace, as was the case in 1945, American leadership. We don't have that leadership, we don't have that vision, and they are For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, you have another part of the world that is bigger than we are. Now, what that means, I don't know. Maybe we're lucky we're in Seattle and have REI to buy freeze-dried foods and you can go to the Cascades. I don't know, but certainly it's a different world. Yeah, Ken?
Don, the title of your talk seems to indicate that that it's inevitable that the American century should come to an end. And the essence of your talk, as I understood it, was that's because of the strength of the Wilsonian tradition, which is kept us from proper leadership. So, is there another country that can provide the leadership to reform international institutions in the way that your conclusion said was necessary in order to bring about a new world order?
There's none on the horizon. I'm sorry, there's none on the horizon. The question was, Ken implied that the reason for our failure, or the inevitable end of the American century, was Wilsonianism. And his question was, is there any other country capable of creating a formula, however different, that could manage the world the way Wilsonianism did? And my answer to it is probably not right now. I don't think it's possible to universalize a set of values in the world in which we live. I don't think we're going to give up our Wilsonianism. I'm a Wilsonian. I mean, if I were in China, I'd be in jail in 3 days. I understand that. And I certainly am not endorsing. But what I am saying is that we live in a world where a framework that tries to be uniform, that tries to make everybody like us, which was genuinely possible and brilliantly successful, actually, during the Cold War, is no longer an option. In 1945, Europe was bombed out. Japan had been bombed into the Stone Age. China was in civil war. Much of Southeast Asia, all of Africa, much of the Middle East were in post-colonial chaos of varying kinds. And there was a vacuum, and we were the power. That's not the case anymore. That's not the case anymore. And the challenge is really to create a framework where diversity is acceptable. You negotiate interests, but you don't argue about values. Where you define the perimeters of choice that are negotiable, whether they're technical or regulatory or whatever it is. But you don't go in and say, as we consistently do, that until you measure up on civil rights, we're not going to deal with you, for example, with China. This is, I'm sympathetic. I mean, I myself am very sympathetic with that approach, but it's not functional, it's not operative. And I think the paralysis, it's not just the inadequacies of Wilsonianism. That's not going to change. I'm not asking America to change its spots. That's absurd. Anymore, now we may, in the sense of, but I'm saying that to insist that everybody be like us is wrong. In my lectures, my phrase, I actually did this a couple of times, believe it or not. Those of you who have taken my classes will believe it. Were Wilsonianism to have worked, if everybody had become democratic and capitalist and prosperous, the world would become a gigantic theme park. And It's a Small World After All would be played constantly. And all we would spend our time is, eating ethnic foods and wearing different costumes. I hope this comes to pass. And I know my grandchildren will love it because they go to Disneyland all the time. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. And in this interim, it's an interim. Ken's question is a good one because in the interim, for certainly the next several decades, it's going to be a really dicey period where you try to figure out what's going on, and I'm very pessimistic given the partisan immobilism in Washington and the debate, even among the pundits on television, which is all short-term and largely meaningless. Yeah, yes?
Thank you, Don. That was a very interesting talk. I wonder if you can, based on what you said about what you see, especially in Asia, I wonder if you can reflect on what you see as the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Yes, the question was, what do I see as the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance? I think that's an easy one. I mean, actually. I think the inertia of Washington, and I blame Washington more than I do Tokyo, and the incapacity of Tokyo. I mean, Abe is trying to, the current prime minister is trying to change things a little bit, and he may be doing it in a ham-handed fashion, but the difficulty of initiating change from Tokyo is so substantial that rather, I recommended, I was thrown out of the State Department for doing this, as Ken will attest. I said back in the early 70s that we should signal that they should be a partner with us, much the way Germany and others were, and that this should have been done 30 years ago when we had leverage. Today, it's much more complicated. China's replaced the United States as their leading trading partner, and there's this paradox of animus between them. There's animosity with South Korea. I think the American-Japanese alliance should, if I were king or Secretary of State, should be multilateralized. I think that that whole area over there should be approached in a different way. The alliance made sense and was brilliantly successful for many, many years. But now the world is so different. Security, this is another paper I wrote. Security in the world is constabulary. It's not strategic. Virtually everything that's going on has gone on since the end of the Cold War. There's something that should have been handled by an international military force, not by the United States and coalitions of the willing that are bought and all this nonsense. And the UN has an article that allows this, but it never would be enacted now. These are not strategic threats to the United States, but terrorism is horrific. Nuclear proliferation is horrific. And you probably could get agreement on these things. So I would argue, and the answer to your question, to get away from bilateralism, to multilateralize it, and even have it overlap with agreements on, internet governance or whatever, pick a topic. I think that's the future, not the pattern of the Cold War. Yeah.
So you've often talked about the need for new multilateral organizations. And I was just thinking, how do you imagine, in an ideal world, they would operate? I mean, what kind of multilateral organizations would you like to see?
Well, all right. The question was, what kind of multilateral organization would I see? Well, and Saudi has edited a very interesting book on Asian efforts at doing this. And there is a lot to be learned from the efforts, regional efforts in Asia. Most of these things, as the Arctic Circles or an Arctic Council is another example of, they're talk shops. They don't have sanctions, they don't have representation. People go there and talk. And that's good. I mean, they're transitional institutions. So I guess my first step would be, if I were dealing with Northeast Asia, and I actually spent a couple of years, and of course failed, to get the Koreans to set up in Incheon or Seoul, a Northeast Asian forum of some sort, and invite people to come to it. Partly because Korea is small, you're never going to do it in Japan, you couldn't do it in China, and certainly you couldn't do it in Russia. And it would be, yeah. And then, hopefully, out of that, you could have specific issues, project-driven issues, like energy, like hydropower and above all, what I've talked about the Arctic. If you can't figure out what to do about the Arctic and global warming, I'm not holding out much hope for anything because there are lots of fish and animals up there, very few people, and none of the history that makes it difficult in Asia. So if you start easily and get agreement on it, then hope for the best. You're not going to have a hegemonic war. That's the only time you have these great big solutions. We're not going to have a nuclear war. No, there'll be nothing left. We might have a cyber war. That's probable because there'll be something to rule after the war. But so the answer is incremental and ad hoc, and there is no formula. And you're not going to have another American century or Chinese century. That I think that's probably time. But thank you very much for a very nice evening.